Welcome. This is part one of a three-part video module series introducing you to social emotional engagement, knowledge, and skills. My name is Emily Rubin, and I'm a co-developer of what we refer to as SEEKS. SEEKS is a professional learning approach that's designed to provide us with tools to measure engagement in our students, as well as to adjust instructional strategies to enhance engagement. And finally, to provide us with a framework for mentoring one another to sustain our efforts over time. In this session, we're going to focus on the why of engagement and how critical it is to provide a positive learning environment where social emotional engagement is literally the fuel for our students' learning. While we often talk about teaching language skills, literacy skills, and academic milestones, the truth is our students have to pay attention to us first. They have to find us interesting, predictable, and most ideally captivating in order to learn language, literacy, and academic skills. So we're going to talk about that why of student engagement in this particular module. This particular video module series was created in partnership with the Sandra Donegan Deal Center for Early Language and Literacy. The Deal Center supports universal literacy by focusing on research-based professional development focused on the neuroscience of early language and literacy development, and also the principles of implementation science so that we can study evidence-based programs and interventions and different methods for sustaining and scaling out our work across the school system and beyond. We also want to be focused on coaching practices for training and development and how do we sustain our efforts. If you want to learn more about the Deal Center for Early Language and Literacy, the website is provided here. So what's the plan for this three-part course? In this part one, we're going to talk about the why, which is how current neuroscience shows us that social emotional engagement is a powerful fuel for brain development, for language, and for literacy. So part one of this three-part course is going to give you the tools for measuring student engagement, and you're going to have those tools to take away from after this particular module. As we look forward into part two, we're going to talk about the what. That's once we identify opportunities to address student engagement, we're going to talk about what instructional strategies are there to support student investment, student independence, and student initiation. Next, we're going to go into the how of social emotional engagement and how we use appreciative inquiry techniques and support one another by fostering student investment, independence, and initiation, by watching each other, appreciating what we're already doing in those moments, and then inquiring where there might be opportunities and collaborating together around the tools of SEEKS to see if we can find some additional instructional strategies that would enhance efforts to foster student engagement. But before I jump right into the why of social emotional engagement, I want to make sure that you're in the zone for learning. Sitting in front of a webinar is really not always the most ideal way to learn. And if you haven't learned about this particular approach already, the zones of regulation is just a simple tool to help you understand where are you right now? Are you in the green zone for learning? Is your central nervous system like ready to listen to me for the next hour or so and learn about engagement? If not, let's think about this. Are you in the blue zone? The blue zone would be when your central nervous system's like, oh, I can't handle this anymore. I'm tired, I'm exhausted. You might then have all these associated emotions with it, like sad, lazy, depressed, maybe even skeptical or pessimistic. It may just be that your body's just like too understimulated. You need to get moving. And so I'm going to give you some strategies right now to how to get it into the green zone. Now, the green zone is the just right. You're interested, you're captivated, you're ready to learn, but boy, is it hard to stay in the green zone. So I want to give you some tools and strategies to stay in the green in just a moment. And then as you slip into the yellow zone, it's when you're irritable, annoyed, bothered. I want to give you some tools to get you back down into the blue, to get you back down into the green zone again. And finally, if you slip into the red, I need to know about it. I wish I could interact with you about it, but I'm going to let you know some strategies that you can use to kind of regulate yourself and get back into either the yellow or the green. So if you find yourself slipping into the blue zone, you could move, stand, even dance a little while participating. While you're listening to me, you don't have to be sitting. You could be literally standing, moving, dancing, and that will help you stay engaged with me for the next several minutes or so. If you're in the green zone, but wanting to know the time-ordered agenda for these courses, let's revisit the plan. Remember, what we're talking about in this session is the why. When we finish that, we're going to take a break. We'll come back. We'll talk about the what and so forth. And of course, you can take a break anytime just by pausing me. And what if you are in the yellow or the red zone? What can you do? Well, I've got a few ideas from my emotion keychain. You might get into the yellow zone because you're feeling kind of tired, and listening to all this instruction is really exhausting to you. On the back side of this emotional keyring, I've got some ideas for you. Why don't you choose an alternative seat? One of those bouncy chairs, for example, where you can just like bounce along while you're listening to me. Or you can get up and do a little quick walk, get a cold drink of water, do some stretches. Those are things to keep you actively engaged with me throughout this session. If by chance you get into the red zone, maybe you get angry at me for some reason. I don't know why, but I can admit that I've been angry in webinars before or other, conferences, and the instructor saying something that may contradict what, practices you're using in the classroom, and that could be pretty irritating. If you're feeling angry, I want to make sure that at any given time, you could write me an email, and that way you're posing a question to me that I will address for you. I don't want you to stay emotionally dysregulated while learning. So there are things that you can do about these things. I just wanted to make sure that you were alerted to them. Most importantly, what's going to get you in the zone for learning? What are you going to learn today? I want you to know that you're investing your time so that you can take away strategies for measuring student engagement, adjusting instructional practices to enhance engagement, and then to mentor one another to sustain this work. So just do a quick check-in time. What zone are you in right now? And what strategies do you plan to use to stay engaged during this particular webinar? I'm giving you permission to pause me right now and think about that. And when you're thinking about it, think about maybe getting up and going and getting that cup of coffee or something to write with so that you can take notes or to doodle or whatever. Whatever strategies you need to stay actively engaged with me, pause and take note, take care of yourself right now. And I'll be here when you get back. So let's tackle the why of social emotional engagement and why this is so critical for our students to learn their literacy and other academic milestones. Why do we benefit from measuring and addressing student engagement? This particular set of modules is going to be heavily focused on how do we get our kids to grade level reading by 3rd grade and ultimately accessing literacy as a means to learn all of those academic milestones that they need all the way through high school graduation. Why do we benefit from focusing on student engagement? Well, with reading, children read because they want to hear what the author has to say. Children write because they want to communicate with other people. The art of literacy, everything about reading, is social. It begins with social connections. The more socially connected you are, the more you want to hear what other people have to say in a text, and the more you want to write and communicate with people through your written literacy. It all begins with relationships. So while our focus is on critical outcomes such as language skills, literacy, and academic milestones, we need to understand what enables a child to be ready to learn. We must understand why some children are compelled to actively engage in literacy instruction, and some children are just disconnected and not connecting to their either peers or to you as their teacher or their instructor. At the heart of all of that is a strong and positive and healthy relationship. But there's also some neuroscience behind that I'm going to share with you right now. First, though, I'm going to put you into a classroom environment. Let's put ourselves into 5th grade, and let's think about the learning standard that this teacher needs to accomplish right now. She's been instructed by her administrators and by the state that she's got to get all her 5th graders to learn about how to calculate the volume of a cube. In just a moment, though, one of her students is going to suggest to her that he's not so interested in this. How does he do that? Well, he's sitting there looking at her right now. He's the one closest to us in the gray sweatshirt. In just a moment, he's going to roll his eyes and put his head right down into his arms. If any one of your students does that, it means they're checking out. Now, we could stop and pause and think, what's in that young man's mind? And there could be many different things. It's almost impossible to actually read someone's mind. But we could be thinking, why am I learning this? It's not relevant in my life. He could be thinking, this is too hard. I'm confused by it. I don't want to do something that's too challenging for me. Or it could be the complete opposite. We did this like 2 weeks ago. It's so easy. I'm bored out of my mind. All those 3 different things. It's not relevant. It's too hard. It's boring. They're negative. Now the teacher notices him right away. She could call him out and say, hey, you're my student. I'm your teacher. You need to sit up and pay attention to me. But I'd almost guarantee that's probably not going to change his mindset. She knows that too. She's way too brilliant for this. So what she does instead is she's going to turn and pay more attention to the boy sitting next to him, and he's going to come through for her. So let's just see what happens at first.
But it's not the top, it's the bottom. So this is what keeps it firm and stable on the table, right?
And so as you see right here, he's shutting down. She's at that moment where there's a choice. Do I call him out and say, you need to sit up, young man, and pay attention to me? Or do I get him socially jealous by paying more attention to the boy to his left right now? And that's what she chooses to do. She turns and talks to the boy just to this young man's left. And as a result, our guy gets a little jealous and he throws in some information. And when he contributes, see how his teacher responds to him.
What gives something a foundation? Boom. Go ahead, Christian. All right. So.
And what was that moment of connection that I was talking about? Let's take a look. Imagine your teacher going, boom, like I care about you at this particular moment. And very interestingly, just a moment later, this young man pops his head up and he's ready to learn. He looks right at her. Now, let's not fool ourselves. He's not like, all right, volume of a cube, I'm totally into this. That's not at all what he was thinking, probably. He was probably thinking, I'm curious about my teacher. She makes me interested. She's funny. She cares about me. I'm connected to her. Learning begins with that social connection. And what happened is his head popped up. From a neuroscience perspective, I'm too much of a geek of brain science to not think about what actually happened in his brain right there. The lights turned on. And what does that mean? He got a release of neuroendorphins in his brain just there that said, crave this, want this. What was that neuroendorphin called? It was called dopamine. And you don't have to be a child of the 70s like me to know what dopamine is, because it's just dope. Dope is this neuroendorphin that says, want this, crave this. She just gave that to him. She gave him a desire to crave learning, to be wanting to be a part of this social context so that he can learn a mathematical skill like the volume of a cube. That's something she did. I often tease and say she's kind of a drug dealer, but the good kind, the kind that gives out the stuff that makes you want to learn, dopamine. And so this neuroscience is critical. If we want our children to develop literacy skills, to learn how to read, they need to fall in love with people first. They need to crave learning. They need to crave the connections that they have with their caregivers, with their teachers and their peers. So we need to understand neurodevelopment and brain development in general. I absolutely love this slide because this slide shows us how important it is to recognize that our children are developing their brains all the way through early childhood, elementary, and into middle and high school years. We don't reach the full size of our brains until about 25 years of age. So our brains are growing every day in our childhood and our adolescence. How do brains grow? I chuckle when I think about when my children were growing up. I remember my pediatrician visits and how much they obsessed with how much they were gaining weight and what I was feeding them. Now, nutrition is extremely important for healthy development. But when it comes to brain development, there's another juice that we need. I said to my pediatrician, you know what, so are you trying to say that if I fed my babies really well and they had good nutrition, they're physically growing, that their brains are going to grow? And he looked at me like this. I said, I think they need some interaction. They need that serve and volley and serve and volley. And that's what actually grows brain development and actually creates that growth that we want to see in our children's brain. The first phase of brain development is referred to by most as attachment. It's happening in the first couple of years of life predominantly, but continues all the way through our lifetime. As we develop our social brain, what we're doing as human beings is falling in love with the social world. If we think people are interesting and captivating, we're going to learn. And that region of the brain says, pay attention to people, listen to people, go back and forth with people, learn. That's how human beings learn. Where does it all begin? Well, in the first couple of months of life, that's what I'm going to focus on today. What we see is that children have this natural orientation toward people. But when that child is orienting toward a caregiver, toward a teacher, toward a peer, those that are born with the genetic advantages towards social engagement are going to get releases of that beautiful neuroendorphin, dopamine, that says crave this, want this. Other genetic advantages also come through at this point. If you are born with an inclination toward people, you're also going to get a release of opioids, the good kind, the free of charge, no prescription necessary, not illegal. You get it from healthy, positive social connections between caregiver and their child. Those opioids mix into that dopamine release, and it gives you that feel-good feeling. So not only are you craving this, but you're feeling good about it. Those are your genetics in action. Now, not all children are born genetically the same. We're all born a little bit different. Some of us get a little bit less dopamine or more dopamine. Others get a little less opioid or not in relation to social. So we need to think about how do we as caregivers play a role in this? And that's the nurture side of this. This caregiver is interacting with her little girl. And what you'll see is she's also giving her additional chemicals. She gives her a pheromone or a hormone called oxytocin. Hormones that are pheromones actually float through the air. And this one's really kind of interesting. It actually breaks through the blood-brain barrier of those that you're interacting with. That oxytocin stirs onto your dopamine and opioids and creates what I refer to as an oxytocin mixed cocktail from heaven. Now, what does oxytocin do? Well, most pheromones are attractants. So it's saying, if you crave me and you're stimulated by me, come to me, interact with me. And that real high, chemical mix says interacting with people is really the most important thing you can do. But the neuroscientists have also confirmed that oxytocin is a huge critical ingredient for building healthy brains. So you really need to have those positive connections to grow and learn. And we can control how much oxytocin we give, how much of that connection we offer. Why is this so important for early brain development, but also as children come into our elementary schools, middle and high school, is that we're forming something called the social brain. This is the region of the brain that says, pay attention to people, pay attention to your teachers, your peers, pay attention to the world around you so that you can learn. And if you see a child in your classroom that doesn't find people that particularly interesting, doesn't find them predictable, trustworthy, or captivating, we got to work on this part of the brain. We got to get them captivated. And how we do that? Through those beautiful oxytocin cocktails, serve and return, connecting with them. And so this is a huge part of healthy brain development. Now, I'm a speech and language pathologist by trade, so I'm particularly interested in the social brain because it fuels the next phase of brain development, where children and young people, they start seeking out social connections with words and start developing the language hemispheres of their brain. Why do children talk and develop language? Because they have something to say. If children do not have strong social connections, they will very likely have language delays. And we need to see the language regions of the brain blossoming and growing in the context of social interaction. Now, this child could be turning to his peer and simply saying, I want yellow block. But it's highly unlikely. He's very likely saying, Max play, Max build the tower, and he's using that child's name, peers' names, teachers' names, caregivers' names, plus verbs. Subject and verb is a really important part of building language. It's about internal intents, and language skills allows you to communicate to other people what your intent is, what their intent is, allows you to form simple sentence structure of subject, verb, and noun. If you're not having strong social connections, oftentimes your language develops, but it plateaus as you've developed too much nouns. Like you might say, I want yellow block, but you're not going to use people's names and verbs, and you won't continue to develop the language regions of your brain. Some children, for example, do talk quite a bit, but they don't talk in these full, beautiful, complete sentences. It's hard to catch this sometimes because they're talking a lot, but they don't use rich discussions of people, verbs, and nouns to talk about the present, the past, and the future. These vulnerabilities do affect learning and literacy as we move forward into the school age years. Now, why are the language regions so critical? Because they provide the foundation for the final phase of brain development that we all are continuing to improve on even into our adulthood. And that is learning how to succeed into a range of social situations. How do I become a student in a classroom, a peer in the hallway, a player on a sports team? The rules change constantly and given those situations. And what you're going to need is strong language skills and a lot of social motivation to develop your executive functioning. You need to be able to talk about the present, the past, and the future, to analyze different situations, and you need the social motivation to drive you in that direction. Now, where we live here in Georgia, we have a readiness tool for children entering into kindergarten, the G-Kids. We want to know that children are ready for kindergarten, ready to learn literacy, to learn their reading, and to learn, other academic milestones. How do we know that kids are ready to learn? Well, this is what I imagine, this child coming to kindergarten for the very first time, showing off his executive functioning. Maybe he doesn't even know any of the peers or the teachers at the school. He's new to the neighborhood, but he had genetic advantages growing up in terms of his interest in people, the dopamine, the opioids. He had lots of nurture from his caregivers, a strong early childhood program. And so he had fallen in love with the social world and developed strong language skills and the beginning of executive functioning coming into kindergarten. He shows up that day, planned ahead to wear his favorite sports team shirt because he was sure he was going to find another child as interested in sports as he was. First day of school, he shows up with his lunchbox ready to go to learn. He's greeted by the principal of the school as he walks in, but then he sees his classroom and he runs through the door. First thing happening, running through the door, you can imagine the kindergarten teacher across the hallway seeing a child running into the door. Without even thinking, this teacher says, "Young man, we don't run in here." After 5 years of waiting to meet the kindergarten teacher, the first thing out of the mouth of that teacher is a scolding word, which by the all we can all relate to whether or not we did that scolding. The child, though, does not get heartbroken. That child actually shows remorse. He stops and goes, oh, I love people. I want to maintain my relationships with people over time. So I'm going to clarify myself. He turns to look at her and says, oh, you must be my teacher. And says, I was just trying to talk to the boy wearing this, the Atlanta United shirt across the room right there. And she goes, oh, well, his name is Joshua. You can talk to Joshua later, but first you need to sit down and do some really boring work right now. We're doing some independent work, and I want you to write your name 5 times on a piece of paper. Now, she didn't put the word boring, but when he looked at it, that's what he saw, a very boring activity. But he had used his social motivation and remorse paired with subject, verb, noun, boys wearing Atlanta United shirt to explain his behavior. Then he looks at this activity. I have to write my name 5 times before I can talk to this kid. And she goes, yes, James, first write your name 5 times, then you can talk to Joshua. So he goes, oh, James, write your name 5 times, then James talk to Joshua. He sits down, does something he does not want to do, but he sits down, he uses James, write name 5 times, James talk to Joshua, does his work perfectly, hands it to her, and walks off to go talk to his new friend. What just happened right there? That's absolutely insane. Well, he used his social motivation to show remorse, to explain himself. He used his language skills to communicate why he was engaging in a particular behavior. Then he used his language skills to delay his gratification for talking to the peer and organizing his behavior in accordance to the new norms of this brand new classroom. That's what we call executive functioning. He was ready to learn. Why? He had a strong, healthy background of really liking people, trusting people, finding people predictable. He had strong language skills, and now he's ready to go. How was all of that fueled? It was fueled by a high dose of oxytocin cocktail. And as you can see right here, this neuroscientist clearly put, if you've got a brain, that's your engine for thinking, for learning, for figuring out how to use your language skills, your literacy skills, and academic skills. But you need oxytocin, dopamine, and opioids to do that. You need social connections back and forth to learn. Whether you are a 2-year-old or whether you are a 15-year-old, you're going to need to feel that captivation in the social world in order to maintain your interest in the world around you and to learn. So one thing that you're probably getting a sense of in this particular discussion is that we're not just, parents, teachers, early childhood educators, elementary school teachers, but we are brain architects. We are actually fueling the brain's growth. And so whenever we see students come into our classroom, we're going to think, if they're not paying attention to us, how do I become captivating so their brain learns that people are amazing? And if they're not communicating that much in our classroom, how do I make sure that they're serve and volleying with their peers and with me so they develop those language regions of their brain and continue to do that into their middle school, high school years so that they know that other people are a source of information and connection. So ultimately you get to a phase where they can worry about social maintaining. They like people so much that they work hard to fit in. They get good grades. They want to read because they want to hear what authors have to say. They want to write so they can communicate with a broader community. That gets them up to that final phase of brain development. So with all of this information coming at you, I wanted you to take some reflection time, whether you're learning on your own or you're with a group of professionals. I want you to potentially pause the recording right now and ponder these 3 questions. I want you to think about, how do we define whether or not a student's brain is lit up and engaged? These responses, I want you to write them down because they're going to become a part of how we define engagement moving forward. How do your students show engagement, or your children if you're working with younger children? What emotions are they displaying? How do they show their investment? And then how do they show that they're independently participating in the activities as they're supposed to be? Do they understand the expectations of an activity? In a school environment, does that mean, do they retrieve their materials? Are they sitting where they're supposed to be sitting? Are they working through the challenges of the task in a manner that is expected for that situation? Are they independent? And then finally, are they communicating with their peers and with you their knowledge in whatever means they can? Are they initiating? So I want you to think about these 3 areas. How do your children show investment, independence, and initiation? Feel free to pause the recording. Just write a few things down under each of those categories of how you view student engagement. because when we come back, I'm going to reflect on that information. I want you to reflect on it, how it ties into how we measure engagement as we move forward into this process. So if you've taken the time to reflect, hopefully you've come up with some concepts here, that there are three elements of active engagement. Sometimes when I ask educators, say, what does an engaged learner look like? Sometimes you see a response that says, well, the kid that's doing their work, they're productive, they're getting their work accomplished, and they're turning it in. That falls into the category of independence. Well, yeah, they're doing their work. They must know what the expectations are. They must know how to access the tools in their environment to be able to finish the work on their own. And they understand the academic concepts that are being taught too. So they're independent. But there's another couple of flavors here. They're also enjoying themselves. They're showing some resilience. So they're able to sustain their attention. They seem invested in what they're doing. So that's another element of active engagement we want to look at. Did we get the hook? Now they're getting the hook, they're independent, but wait a second. You could have a kid who's really enjoying himself, is sustaining his attention, but his face is in a screen the entire time, and he's diligently producing, but is he initiating? Is he or she showing what he knows to, or he or she knows to a peer or to a teacher? Are they initiating? We've got to have all three to truly know that we've got active engagement in our classrooms: investment, independence, and initiation. And how do we measure that? In your handout materials, you will have a full-page version of this tool. It's called the Social Engagement Ladder. The Social Engagement Ladder is a relatively simple rubric that we use to watch an activity in the natural routines, either at home or at school. And in this particular case, we're going to focus on literacy-based instruction. We're going to look at that activity for a full 20 minutes. We're doing a read aloud, and we're going to look at that whole group of students. We're going to figure out in that group of students how many of them are either a 0, a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4. And so what would a 0 look like right here if I put this here? Well, a 0 is a no-focus student, or a child who's just not connecting with the social world around them, doesn't respond to teacher or peers' bids for interaction, is showing no initiation, and is not yet following any of the teacher's instructions. So they do not appear yet to be invested, independent, or initiating. That child may look like the kid with the hoodie over his head, sitting at his desk with his head down, or just kind of checked out. That's uncommon, but nonetheless, it's what we want to capture in our engagement ladder. Those are the kids that no focus. Then there are some children who might be emerging fleeting. And what that means is they intermittently pay attention to you. They might unpredictably dive into the lesson for a moment, but then they're out and they're on their own agenda for a little while and you really don't know how to redirect them. Those might be the emerging fleeting kids. Then there's these partially engaged children. These are children who respond to teacher and peer instructions or ideas, who follow directions, but every now and then they share their emotion. Maybe they initiate once or twice, but it's pretty seldom. These kids I would describe as very passive, but very cooperative or compliant. And when we do the social engagement ladder in many of our schools and classrooms, this is often the statistical mode, which is a fancy word for the most frequently seen number. It is what we often see: children flying under the radar, doing as they're told, but not really lit up in their brain with that beautiful oxytocin cocktail. If we want to fuel learning, we got to start climbing a little bit higher. And let's move up to the mostly engaged. If we can get kids mostly engaged, we got kids initiating, showing what they know. We've got kids showing some independence with accessing the materials and understanding the expectations. And we've got kids who are invested, who stick with the task even when it gets hard. So we've got investment, independence, and initiation. Just a little bit of all that, we've got a mostly engaged kid. Now, every now and then, you get some fully engaged kids. Kids who have forgotten they want to be anywhere else than in that lesson, learning that learning standard with you, or in that activity with you in the natural routine. That's a fully engaged kid. They're so lit up with oxytocin cocktails, they're not even turning to the right or turning to the left with any distractions because they care and they're so captivated by the social world. And so I wanted to share with you, how does this help us? How does this help us know that our students are fueled for learning? If we're using this in a group environment, What we would do after about 20 minutes of watching children, sometimes I literally draw a map of the classroom, and I might initially give child a 2, and then they went up to a 3, and then went down to a 1. And then overall, you get with every child in the classroom what their predominant number was for their engagement level. And then you averaged it together as a group. So if you have several kids who are at a 4, a bunch of kids at a 3, and then several kids at a 2, you're going to have a bell curve that wraps itself around a mostly engaged group of kids. That means that our lesson plan and our instructional strategies seem to be fueling learning. That said, if we see that our bell curve's a little bit lower than the 2.5 or below, we have only a few kids who are mostly engaged and most kids are partially or in emerging fleeting, that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity. What can we do to enhance engagement, get kids flying up the ladder? There are individual versions of this so that if you do see that child who's a 0 or a 1 on that engagement ladder, you can look at that child all day long and try to find those moments when they are a 2 or above and really analyze what works to get this kid hooked. And also, if you see children at 0s and 1s multiple times, if you're using this to assess for instructional delivery, you see a child hanging out at that 0 and 1, it might be a signal. It might be a signal that maybe their language is delayed, they're not as socially connected, there may be something going on individually with that student that we need to be thinking about. So this tool has a lot of different utility to it. So I wanted to share with you what it actually looks like in action. I'm going to put you into a Head Start classroom. This is actually a preschool program where the focus is on literacy outcomes. We want to make sure that these kids get hooked on reading and that they become grade level readers. This teacher knows that. She's just read them, The Very Hungry Caterpillar. And right after reading it, she's like, I want them to truly understand the content of that story. I want them to understand that caterpillars eat a lot. And after they eat a lot, they turn into this, they make a little cocoon and they metamorphosize into beautiful butterflies. How will they ever understand that concept? Well, she created a sort of a rhythm, a little bit of music. And what she's got in front of them is the food of the leaf. Every single one of them has a leaf in front of them. And they all have a sock in their hand. That sock is their caterpillar, and the caterpillar eats off the leaf. And after time, the caterpillar, you get to turn the sock inside out and it turns into a butterfly. So she's going to give them an experiential lesson on how caterpillars turn into butterflies just after reading Eric Carle's The Very Hungry Caterpillar. And so what I want you to look for is we're going to use the engagement ladder with this crew. We're going to see what these 12 children are doing. Are they invested? Are they independent? And are they initiating with one another? And how would we literally score that so that we had some data to help us understand, are these kids actively engaged? So enjoy the video and then we'll reflect on it right afterward.
So that he can see a caterpillar eats on leaves, eats on leaves, eats on leaves. A caterpillar eats on leaves to get some energy. A caterpillar rests in a pupa, rests in a pupa, rests in a pupa. A caterpillar rests in a pupa and becomes a butterfly. You gotta turn your sock inside out and show me your butterfly, because that is the life cycle of the butterfly. My butterfly has beautiful colors because they're very beautiful.
You got green.
You got green in your butterfly? Do the sock right. Thank you. This is how you do. You did a good job. Now you got to show your butterfly.
So as I watch that that particular video, I get filled up with that dopamine. I get so stimulated and I crave this. I hear joy. I hear that chatter at the end, that loudness in the classroom. It is a signal of how invested and how much initiation you're seeing from these students. So what did I notice when I was watching this video? And how is that going to help me score the engagement ladder? I noticed student investment. And what it means to be invested is, has the learner been hooked? Is that attention being sustained? So it's one thing to hook a kid into a lesson, but do you see them invested through the entire lesson? That's how we judge if they're beyond a 2 on the engagement ladder, which is that partial engagement. How do we know they're mostly engaged? Is they not only are invested in the activity, but they sustain it for the entire activity. So you see these 2 girls right here. And what you see there is, I see pure joy. This young lady over here smiling literally the whole entire activity. So we see their facial expressions, we see their connection, we see their joy, we notice their facial expressions, body orientation, and so forth. And that was a signal that they were invested. They remained with the activity for the full duration. I also see this young man over here happily participating the entire time, staying where he's supposed to be staying and staying focused on the song and the activity at hand. What I noticed was that the music and the movement and the surprises appeared to stimulate the interest and investment initially and then sustain investment throughout the activity. So I noticed a number of the students that are quite invested. What else did I notice in this particular activity? Let's see. I noticed independence. So what is independence? How do you know a child is independent in any given activity? Well, is the learner using the tools such as the role models that's being provided for him, the hands-on materials and visuals that he has, like the leaf in front of him? Do those tools help him follow expectations so that he can be independent? Well, I certainly noticed that when you model expectations for this particular child, it seemed to foster his independence. This particular moment where you see the teacher sitting right next to the child modeling the action, and then you see the child modeling after the teacher, that child is showing his independence because he's accessing the tools around him and saying, I know what to do, so I'm going to do it. I'm following the actions, I'm following the cues, I'm with the whole class. And we noticed that in many of the students throughout the activity. But I also noticed initiation. And what does initiation mean? It really refers to the communication element of this. Is this learner communicating to someone? Are they showing us what they know? Did they show up here? Did they show their teacher? This little girl that you see with the white long sleeve shirt. Now she initiated with pretty much everyone. She initiated with the camera person. She initiated with the child to her right, the child to her left, and with her teacher. She probably communicated on 4 or 5 different occasions what color her butterfly's wings were. I noticed that the seating arrangement and the proximity to peers appeared to foster the learner's initiations throughout the task. So we're looking for investment, which means that kind of emotional connection with the content standard. We're looking for the independence. Are they able to actually follow expectations by taking advantage of the tools such as the role modeling and the tool visual supports? And are they showing what they know in the environment? This helps us know when our students are fueled for learning and when there are opportunities as well. There were many children who appeared to be at least a 2 or higher on this engagement ladder. But were there opportunities as well? And I noticed an opportunity for enhancing independence when recalling the actions of each of the verbs in the songs. There was a young child over to the right. It was a very brief moment in the videos that you got to see this young child where the second teacher in the classroom had to get down at that level and remind them of the tools, provided additional role modeling, additional support, maybe a little extra additional verbal guidance as well. And he just needed a little bit more support so that he could be independently doing the actions in the song. He seemed invested though, because he remained seated, he remained with the group. He was interested when he got the surprise at the end to turn the sock inside out to find his butterfly. So we had a little bit of investment and we had a little bit of independence because he got all this extra support. But we didn't see as much independence or initiation here. The child appeared to be invested. He remained with the group. He showed his independence by imitating some of the actions, but there might be an opportunity to increase his independence and or his initiation. Now, as an outside observer, that's not my job to figure out. When we go through the mentorship section of these modules, you'll learn that it's really up to the teacher to look at the data and to think about her students and say, I think with that young man, I would like to increase his independence, or I would like to increase his initiation. And we would go with where the teacher wants to work on for students. I'm not going to come in as an outside observer and make a judgment about this child's engagement because I don't know that child nearly as well as the teacher might. So it is a discussion point and it gives us some data around that. Did we see any other opportunities? This young person sitting next to the teacher, the child appeared to be highly invested. He showed his investment throughout the task with a big smile on his face. And he also appeared to show his independence by participating in the actions. And there were occasions in which he did actually initiate. And what you see here is he's actually giving a thumbs up at one point early on in the song. And he's kind of out of the corner of his eye looking toward his teacher. It's almost an initiation. If you rewatch the video, you might notice though, that there is an opportunity to increase his initiation. At one point, he gets stuck and he can't turn the sock inside out to find his butterfly. So he starts smacking it on the floor as if the floor were a good person to ask for help. And so the teacher responds to him, to kind of that behavior, and says, this is how you do it. But he never directly initiated with his teacher, or he didn't seem to, at least. And so this might be an opportunity to increase his initiation. Should the teacher see it as an opportunity, that's where we might brainstorm. But I want to share with you that young child right here, I might still keep him at a 2, even though he's invested in showing some independence. We don't have all 3 eyes, and you need all 3 eyes to go up to a 3. He's certainly not emerging fleeting, and he's certainly not no focus. He's there, he's learning, he's at least a 2, but there are opportunities to bring him up to a 3. Similarly, when we saw this young child previously, which is, sorry, this child here, that we also would kind of keep him at a 2. He's not emerging fleeting because every time you interact with him, he predictably responds. That means he's partially there, he's partially engaged, but there might be opportunities to get him up to a 3. So how does this all kind of play out? Our engagement data might look like this. And what that means is that we might have 3 children who were so invested and so independent and so much initiation that they forgot that they want to be anywhere else than learning about the life cycle of a caterpillar to a butterfly. There were 3 children, I'd have to say they were on the left side of the video, 2 girls and a boy that were just in love with this activity. They were learning the power of literacy. They were learning that Eric Carle was brilliant in showing how that caterpillar turned into a butterfly, and then they got to experience it themselves. They were fully engaged. Then you had about 5 children in that group that were 3s. They were mostly engaged. They were smiling, they were persistent, they were showing some initiation, showing some independence. They were learning, and those are our 3s. And then there were about 4 children who were responsive, who did as they were told, who always followed instructions, but sometimes needed a little extra instructions or extra support to kind of keep them independent, keep them and get them and support their initiation. So we had about 4 of those kids. If you have 12 children total, you do a little bit of averaging here, and you find out that there's an average of 2.67 of social emotional engagement in this lesson. In most of our schools, we're going for anywhere between a 2.4, 2.5 or above. Like our goal is to get our kids, collectively averaging at least 2.5 or above. And guess what? This particular literacy instruction brought the fuel for learning. This was an actively engaged group of kids. It still gave us information though about what are some of those more passive children, how might we enhance, or are there opportunities to enhance their engagement? And so this is how this tool works. We tally it up. I will say that this was not a fair training of this tool because usually you would watch for a full 20 minutes, not just a 3 or 4 minute clip. But for the sake of just an example, I just did this brief example for you. All right, so let's see where we go next with this. Next, we consider those students that are above a 2. And whenever we are above a 2, we need to reflect, why is this happening? Why do we rock as teachers? Why are we amazing? How did I get these kids to find, investment in this, to support their independence and support their initiation? We need to really reflect on everything we do that gets kids above a 2, because when we do, it gives us information. It gives us an idea of what we need to do to fuel engagement in our students. So this is your time to pause, to feel free to pause this presentation. And I want you to, either in a group with your colleagues or if you're learning on your own, I want you to write down your responses to these 3 areas so that we can help identify what strategies do increase engagement. When your students are above a 2 and they're invested, what are you doing to get them hooked on that lesson? What are you providing for them to get them invested? So I want you to write down a few things related to investment. And then when your students are above a 2 on the engagement ladder and you see their independence, meaning they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're following expectations, what kind of strategies are you providing for them so they know what to do? Are you role modeling for them? Are you giving them tools? Those are the things I want you to be thinking about. And then when you see your students initiating and showing what they know, they're communicating, whether it be through their body language, through their words, through pictures, through writing, what are you providing for them to get them to initiate? So I'd love for you to pause right here. Hopefully the screen remains on so you have these 3 questions to answer. Write down with your groups what you do already. Why don't you take about 5 minutes to do that? Okay, So hopefully you took that time for that reflection. And what you've identified is you're figuring out ways to get that child's whole brain engaged. If we want to turn the lights on and get that full oxytocin cocktail, we better be thinking about what are we doing to get that student's investment, their independence, and their initiation. Let's take a look at the investment area first. If we want students to be invested, we need to stimulate their interest and motivation for learning so that we can get the emotional regions of their brain turned on and lit up. How do we do that? I will tell you, we don't do it the same. Every one of us is different. But what we're consciously doing that is the same is figuring out how to get the hook. Some of us might have written down under the investment strategies, well, you form a strong relationship with the child. That's number one. Maybe you use high affect and you get yourself really engaged yourself. That's another strategy. You might involve gross motor movement, fine motor movement, hands-on materials. Maybe you're working with older students who use a little humor, a little competition, a little group work. There's so many different strategies that we use, but nonetheless, they're all focused on the common outcome of enhancing investment. And so we're going to keep those strategies in a whole category of how do we get kids hooked. But we can't just stop there. We have to get the back of the brain engaged here. And what the back of the brain needs is for us to present information in different ways so this child truly understands the content. If we're trying to teach them phonemic awareness, they need to know what the sounds are and why we're teaching them the sounds and why that's relevant for them. So they need to have information presented in different ways. If we're presenting them with instructions around their literacy activities, we need to let them know visually what's expected. Maybe we need to role model. We need to have hands-on real-life materials. The more understanding a child has, the more independent they're going to be. And so that's one of the other sets of strategies, the routines, the visuals, the role play, the hands-on materials. Last but not least, we've got to get initiation. How do we do that? Well, we differentiate the ways that students can express what they know. We get the frontal lobes in here. We have to get them acting on their knowledge and communicating to a peer or a teacher what they know about this particular learning standard that you're targeting. And that's the initiation part of it. And essentially what I've just shared with you is a framework that's heavily research-based. It's called a Universal Design for Learning Framework. And if you want to learn more about that, you have a website right there to visit. And this is where you would see the research behind how important it is to stimulate interest, to provide information in different ways, and to foster expression in different modes. So how does SEEKS play into this? How do SEEKS and UDL go together? The Social Emotional Engagement Knowledge and Skills Framework ensures that you have the strategies or the freely accessible tools that you might need to follow a universal design while matching the developmental level of the students. And what that means is you may have children who are indeed conversational, so they speak in full sentence structures, but you're still working on their self-efficacy as communicators and their social understanding and conventions. But you might also have some students in your classroom that are emerging language, that are not yet fully using subject, verb, noun, sentence structure. Maybe they talk, but they don't have strong command of language skills. There's going to be sort of different instructional strategies that we might want to think about to get their investment, the independence, and the initiation. And then occasionally, and of course in any given school system, there are going to be children that enter that school system who are before words. And what that means is they have not developed the language regions of their brain yet. Maybe the social regions of the brain haven't fully developed either, that they don't really find people interesting and captivating. There's significant language delays. They don't yet use pictures, sign language, any other forms of speech to communicate. So how do we use a universal design for learning framework with them? How do we get the emotional hook? How do we provide them with supports for their independence? And how do we get them initiating so they can move toward the language developmental regions of brain development? And so we provided for you a tool that you're able to access as part of the SEEKS professional learning that's called the SEEKS Quick Reference Tool. And these are in your handout materials. This is the framework that we're going to use when we go to the what of this concept is what do we do to enhance investment, independence, and initiations? Well, what we do depends on the developmental stage. We know we're going to foster investment. We know we're going to foster independence. And we know that the next page is going to go after initiation. But at the top here, it says, well, what if the student is before words? What if they're emerging language? And what if they are conversational? Most of us may hang out in the right-hand side if that's the group of students that we're working with. But if you know you have students with language delays that are vulnerable in this area, You might want to try some of those supports in the middle section. Certainly children on the conversational end don't mind if you have additional hands-on materials, more visual supports, more contextual support. That's the emerging language. And here we're going to get a lot more sensory at the before word stage. And so this is the tool that we're going to learn a lot about in the what module of this three-part course. I wanted you to just have a sense to look at it, take a moment to see. These are a lot of strategies in here that you already are likely using in your natural routines and in your literacy instruction, but this is going to be our toolkit, where we go when we start to independently problem solve. What could we do to enhance investment, independence, and initiation? So I wanted to show you a teacher who was using this fabulous book, Pete the Cat and His 4 Groovy Buttons, to get the kids hooked on language and literacy. She had a child in her classroom who was at the emerging language stage. So majority of her kids were conversational. It's a integrated preschool classroom with a number of 4-year-olds who can talk like there's no tomorrow, full conversation. So a lot of the children in her classroom were already using conversational level discourse to communicate. But there was a couple of children in her classroom who were still learning how to use combinations of words in full sentences. And she was looking for opportunities to increase all of her students' active engagement because her emerging language students were struggling. They needed a lot of adult support. They often had to sit on their laps. They needed more visuals. And it was a little bit more of an opportunity to increase their investment, independence, and initiation. So initially, to get the investment, one of the things she wanted to do was make sure that as she did a read aloud, she would start to have the students literally act out or role play the actions of the story. Because if you're in emerging language kids and you're hearing the words and you don't understand the words, it becomes very disengaging. But if you hear the words and you get to act out those words, double thumbs up there. Also, you're going to see she's learning to provide visuals for learners to express themselves throughout the activity. So she's got the hands-on materials. That's over here, hands-on, meaningful materials, gross motor movement, all of that. So when she referenced this tool, she's like, you know what? My read aloud is going to look a little bit different. I'm not just going to have them sit and listen to my read aloud. I'm going to have them read with me. So we read the page, we act it out. That way, my emerging language students and my conversational level students can be successful. And so you get to see Pete the Cat and his groovy buttons in action with this group of students. The child that I wanted you to focus on is actually sitting to her right. So when we're looking at her, that's the left-hand side over there with the glasses on. And what you're going to notice, hopefully, is his investment, his independence, and his initiation. Each of them has a plate in front of them, just a paper plate she grabbed off the shelf. And she found a bunch of buttons in the classroom. So as Pete the Cat loses his 4 groovy buttons, they take a button off their plate and stick it on the rug. I find it quite charming that the boy to her right actually takes the button off the plate and sticks it on her knee. So he's giving it to his teacher every time Pete the Cat loses his groovy button. So notice how she's incorporated individual hands-on materials, opportunities for them to act out the story as it's read to them.
My buttons, my 3 groovy buttons, my buttons.
Oh no!
Take one away.
Another button popped up and moved away.
Are you guys gonna cry?
Left.
2.
3 minus 1 equals 2. Did
Pete cry? Goodness no.
buttons
Come and buttons go.
He kept on
Singing. Ready? We have 2.
My buttons, my 2 groovy buttons.
Oh
Oh
no! Another
button popped off.
My favorite runaway.
You left your favorite buttons
On left. How many are left?
2 minus 1 equals 1.
1. There it is.
Did
He cried? Goodness no.
buttons
come and buttons go. Take it off.
He kept
Oh, wait, we got one.
singing
Just one.
his song.
Ready? Buttons. My button. My 1 groovy button. My button.
I don't know if you noticed, but at the one point she was looking over to a child and says, hey, but you've got to take that one off. She was kind of doing that little teacher modeling right there. And then she caught herself. That child had actually been fully independent and was knowing that there was still one more button left. And she corrected herself. She's like, oh, you've got it good. And what I noticed here is that students were invested. I see the positive facial expressions. I see them smiling and sustaining their attention. I also noticed their independence, that they're independently keeping up with the number of buttons that should be on their plate. Some of them are holding up the numbers with their fingers as well. And then I noticed initiation, even in our young boy with the language delays. When he took his button off, he stuck it on his teacher's leg because he's saying, I know what I know. I'm showing you that I know that it's time to take my button off. So we've got independence, investment, and initiation. So this is an activity I'd love to think about some more, is why does this work? What instructional strategies are there to enhance student engagement? And that leads us to you staying tuned for part 2 of 3 of this video module series. We're going to shift from the why, social emotional engagement is the fuel for learning, to the what. And the what is, what instructional strategies might we use to fuel our students' engagement? There may be times when we see that our child's partially engaged or emerging fleeting, and we want to help them climb up that ladder. How do we brainstorm? How do we collaborate to come up with ways to fuel investment, independence, and initiation? So stay tuned, because part 2 of this video module series is going to be about the what.